Just waiting on the lights. Good afternoon, everyone. Those of you joining us in person and virtually, thank you for joining us this afternoon at the Other Israel Film Festival. We have another fabulous day of events and conversations coming up in this space live at 2 p.m. We have What If on War and Peace with Ehud Barak, followed by a conversation. And then at 4:30, we have the screening of the film Blue Box, which you'll learn a lot more about on this panel right now. You are here for the panel discussion, Bridging the Generational Gap Surrounding Israel and Palestine. This was a crucial conversation that came out of the films and the conversations that we were doing this year, and felt that we needed to talk about this generational divide. I think it was highlighted especially this past May during the incidents or war or whatever we're calling it, whatever was going on in Israel, as far as seeing the reactions from the Jewish community and how the Jewish community was really divided. And we saw a big part of this being, of course, an age element playing a place in this, both here in the United States with the Jewish community and in Israel. I'm very proud to introduce our panel that will tackle this topic today. I'll start with our moderator, Ben Sales, who is the senior reporter for JTA, excuse me. Must be some weird typo. Matt Nasanchik, who is the executive director of New York Jewish Agenda. Matt, thank you so much for being here. Alicia Goldberg, director of Media and Policy at NIF, and one of our filmmakers that I mentioned before, director of Blue Box, Michal Weitz. Thank you all, and I hand it over to you.
Hi. Well, it's a pleasure to be on this stage with the three of you, or kind of stage. Just to repeat, I'm Ben. I'm a reporter for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and I'm here with Matt and Alicia and Michal, going from my right to my left. And yeah, so I'm really happy to be here with the three of you. When we talk about generational shifts among American Jews on Israel and Palestine, it's become almost a cliche to note that the generation of World War II witnessed the Holocaust and then the birth of Israel, which they experienced, American Jews experienced as a miracle. Their kids, baby boomers, came of age during the Six-Day War. Whereas millennials were kids during the Oslo peace process. That was certainly true for me, and that whole era. And Gen Z, people that are becoming adults and are in their 20s now, came of age during the era, just to put a shorthand on it, of Bibi Netanyahu and the past 10 or 15 years. So, I think that that's a good framing for kind of how perceptions of Israel have progressed, but I'm going to ask each of you, and of course I want to note also in Israel that there have been clearly generational shifts as well, right? I think kind of for me the headline of this is that younger Israelis tend to be more right-wing on the whole than their parents are, especially Israelis who again came of age during the Second Intifada and then under Netanyahu's term. Than parents who were alive earlier. So I want to ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Matt. How have you experienced those shifts personally, and how do you think they've shaped your community?
Thanks, Ben, for the question, and thanks to Michal and Elisheva, and to the Other Israel Film Festival, and to Isaac for inviting us to be here today. And Isaac is part of the New York Jewish Agenda Leaders Network. Also, our board chair, Nancy Hoffman, is here in the audience. But New York Jewish Agenda is an organization that was founded in 2020 to organize Jews in New York City and state whose values, Jewish and democratic values, shape their politics and policy positions here at home with regard to social justice issues and with respect to our relationship with Israel, because our connection and love for Israel is related to our Jewish and democratic values. And what you said about Israeli youth becoming more right, and I think it's fair to say American Jewish youth becoming more left, kind of sums up the challenge here. But to start, answer your question, I'm recalling when I was a college student a long time ago at Stanford, and I was studying Hebrew and the what then called the Arab-Israeli conflict and Zionism. There was one professor who was up for tenure, Joel Bainan, who was an anti-Zionist. He was Jewish and he was anti-Zionist. And that was incredibly, it felt very anomalous at the time in the American Jewish community. And in fact, my mentor, who was a very left-wing secular Jew, was very concerned himself about this professor getting tenure. Ultimately, this professor got tenure, and he's been there ever since. And my son, who went to Stanford, who is much more to the left, took a class from him when he was at Stanford. But by the time Seth went to Stanford, anti-Zionism in the American Jewish community had become far more common and mainstreamed, right? And so I had this experience a couple of weeks ago where I was in Washington, and I was with my nephews who are in their 20s and my son, who also in his 20s, and they're all very much to the left and would describe themselves on the left with respect to Israel, maybe anti-Zionist, maybe not. I don't know if they would use that label. But this was the week of the whole Sunrise DC incident, where Sunrise DC, which is the DC chapter of the National Sunrise Movement, which was the activist climate change movement that has done a lot of very important work, including sit-ins on Capitol Hill, a hunger strike at the White House, and lots of other political organizing around climate issues, participated in a voting rights rally, a DC statehood rally in DC, and several days before that rally, they issued a statement saying they were withdrawing from the rally because there were 3 organizations participating, the Reform Movement Political Arm, the RAC, National Council of Jewish Women, and the JCPA, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, all of which are Zionist organizations. And because for them, for the Sunrise DC movement, because Zionist organizations align with racism and oppression and colonization and so forth, they were refusing to participate in the rally, and they asked the organizers of the rally to disinvite these 3 groups. And that then produced a whole kind of response and backlash in the Jewish community, and ultimately the National Sunrise Movement condemned the DC chapter for singling out only those Jewish groups in the rally who were Zionists, but not singling out the other groups that also had positions that were Zionist. And so therefore, by singling out only the Jewish groups, that was anti-Semitic. But we're not here to debate what's anti-Semitic and what's not. But it was an extremely problematic incident. That, at the end of that very week, I happened to be at my nephew's birthday party in Adams Morgan in DC, in one of these group houses, and I'm the oldest person there by several decades, but he let me come for like an hour. And I was talking to this woman there, and I said, "What do you do?" And she said, "I'm the national political director for the Sunrise Movement." I said, "Oh, well, you've had a pretty interesting week, huh?" And she kind of rolled her eyes and sighed and said how difficult it was and what a distraction this all was. And she said she was Jewish, and she said she was, anti-Zionist, and it kind of rolled off her tongue as though she was saying, I'm wearing a green shirt and I'm an anti-Zionist, and I live in Washington. But and so the experience of American Jews, younger Jews who grew up in this Netanyahu area, has led them to be in a very different political space from the space that I grew up in, or that my parents' generation grew up in, and they don't define their identity with respect to Israel in the same way that we do, and their political attitude towards Israel and to Zionism is, extremely different from that which I hold and that which many of my co-founders and Leaders Network members and New York Jewish Agenda hold, and certainly Jews in older generations hold as well. So, I have a lot of personal experience because of my connection to my son and his generation, and to some of the political spaces that I find myself where, my liberal Zionist politics are very much in tension with those of the Gen Z world.
Alicia, just to repeat a shorthand of the question, how do you think all of these, thank you, Matt, first of all, and by the way, I appreciate you saying this. I also want to thank the JCC for hosting us in the Other Israel Film Festival. Thank you very much. So, Alicia, just to restate the question briefly, how do you think these generational shifts that our community has experienced, how have you experienced those shifts personally, and how do you think they've shaped our community?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben, and thanks, Matt, for sharing your experience. Hi, everyone. I'm Alicia Goldberg. I work for the New Israel Fund, which is the major organization in the United States working for progressive causes in Israel on the ground. We fund hundreds of NGOs that do progressive work, and we have for over 40 years. So I will start with my own story. And I'll also say, just to do a little framing, that I think that the polls that we set up for ourselves are one generation and the other generation. And I really feel like the polls are not necessarily generational, that it's a matter of emphasis and values. So the way that I think about it is that there is a survivalist impulse and a justice impulse. And I think that both generations have those impulses in real ways. I don't think that my parents are only survivalists, and I don't think that I am only a justice fighter. I also don't think that even my younger sister, who's 10 years younger than I am and is much more like of the Gen Z vibe, is just justice, even though she puts much more emphasis on that. So just I feel like that is an important frame that I think gets lost a lot in these conversations where we're like, oh yeah, 67 was such a big event for my mother, right? She was just like, Israel's gonna be wiped off the map. And then it wasn't. And there's a triumphalist feeling of like, this country is everything. And a feeling of deep identification with that and joy and gladness that it exists. And anything that kind of like comes at that feeling is dangerous and threatening. But she's not just that. My mom, grew up in liberal Seattle, Washington, a Democrat through and through her whole life. She's a lawyer. She's a fifth generation American. And so that's my mom. My father is the child of Holocaust survivors. And so I grew up with a survivalist instinct in me that was passed on through the way that we ate, was passed on through the way that we related to scarcity in general. And my grandparents, and their stories were told to me over and over and over. My mother wrote a book about their stories. And those stories are deeply a part of who I am. So the stories of like my grandmother living the entirety of the war in a pit in the middle of rural Poland, and my grandfather surviving the death camp Treblinka, where 60 people survived, escaping the Red Army, surviving by jumping into a river and hoping that he could find his way to the other side because he didn't know how to swim. And what we discovered about that story is that he wound up on the same side of the river. He didn't know it. He thought he was on the other side by the time he woke up. But they both survived, and that feeling, and then they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps in Brooklyn, as my grandfather started as a feather plucker and wound up a butcher, and that was their livelihood. And so, the fact that my father then went to a very nice New York Stuyvesant high school and became a doctor and sort of like went through that process of, and now we're Americans and we can't really breathe easy, but we're Americans and we're a little safer than we were back in Poland, but it could happen here. That survivalist instinct is also a part of me. So I have, like a very progressive liberal pull on the one hand and a very survivalist instinct on the other. And again, I think that, the whole conversation for me is a matter of figuring out who's putting emphasis on what. And I want to push my parents, and I want them to push me, actually. And I think I can probably end there. I think I've answered both of those pieces of the personal and the communal.
I would love to hear more about the swimming in the river, seriously, but yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you, Alicia.
Sure.
And Michal, I want to ask you kind of a twist on the question, because obviously you're Israeli, and unless there's something about you I don't know, you didn't grow up here in America.
No.
Yeah, so I want to ask you both how, and your film is about this in large measure, but like how you've experienced generational shifts in Israel, but also I'd love to know, when you look at what you see in the American Jewish community, what's your experience of that as well?
Okay, thank you. Well, I have a lot to say. I think that there is a big gap between what is happening in the United States, Jews in the United States, and what is happening in Israel. I'll start by saying that the word Zionism or anti-Zionism, it's very difficult for Israelis to accept, even to the left-wing people in Israel, because we don't have kind of an alternative. We grew up on the word Zionism. It's a holy word for us. My mom is a Zionist, and my family is so. If now it's going to be a bad word, so it's very difficult for us to accept it. Again, I totally understand why the Zionism is. I have a lot of critique, and I think that Zionism is over. But I think that Israelis, even left-wing, it's very difficult for them to say that we're anti-Zionism or something like that. So even speaking about it, the terminology is very different and difficult. So I think this is one of the problems, and I think that there are a lot of small groups, left-wing, right-wing, Israelis, Americans, and we are not communicating one with each other. I mean, left-wing people in Israel are not communicating. I think that we'll be happy to know that American Jews are standing with us. That we feel kind of a minority in Israel. As you said, a lot of young people are going to the right wing and right opinions, and I think, and I'm allowed to say, this is my opinion, of course, that Bibi Netanyahu has a big role in it. People went through war and another terror attack and another, so it's very hard for us in Israel to see some kind of a solution. So you're starting to be angry, and you want to fight back. And again, this is not. I'm a left wing, but I can understand why young people in Israel are turning to the right side of the political map. And it's very scary because it's very difficult to see some kind of a solution sometime soon. And I think it's very complicated because we are looking for a solution. And for me as a child, as you saw it on the film, my father's family lost one of Joseph White's son died 2 years before the establishment of Israel. My grandmother from my mom's side lost her brother in the battle for Jerusalem in '48. Me and myself, I survived almost, I can say, 3 terror attacks in Jerusalem back then in the Intifada days. And when you're going through all of this, it's very difficult to say. Everything become more complicated. So I think that for me personally, I'll be really happy to find a way to the left wing in Israel to connect with American Jews, to know that we're not a minority, and that they're not turning their back on us. I think that's important for us, and I hear a lot of people in Israel talking about it, that the American Jews are not talking with the same language with us anymore. So yeah, and I think when I worked on the film, I felt that something is starting to move inside of my parents' generation. When I worked on the film, my mom tried to convince me not do it. Go do film about another thing. It's such a sensitive topic. And for her, talking about 48, it's a big taboo. And she was taught not to talk about it. And Alicia, like you said, 67, they felt that they got the state. It was a miracle. And you don't ask questions. You just say thank you and shut up. And now it's a new generation. And for us, we understand that if we're not going to talk about the difficult things, so there is no chance that we're ever going to solve it. And I think that we're not afraid. We're not afraid like my mom and her generation we're afraid to ask questions. We're not afraid, and we're not afraid to say sorry if needed. We don't think that somebody is going to take the state from us. Yeah, that's about it.
I have a few follow-up questions that I'd love to ask about what you said as well. Thank you, Michal, and maybe we'll get to those later. But I want to start, my next question, I want to start with you, Alicia. Each of you, in one sense or another, has kind of one foot in one segment of one community and one foot in another segment or another community. And Alicia, if I may, and please, correct or amend what I'm about to say, but, like you said, you grew up in this kind of traditional Jewish community, pro-Israel home, and of course now you're working very much in the progressive world, and in a sense, NIF tries to bridge that gap, right, between, engaging with Israel and also upholding progressive values. So I want to ask you, we've talked about these fragmentations in various communities and how there's kind of polarization and different opinions. Do you think discussion is possible, and what do you think should be the goal of that kind of discussion?
Yeah. So I'll answer this question first. I think personally, there's another bit of the story to how I came to where I am on all of the issues that Israel faces today. So like you said, Ben, I grew up in a modern Orthodox community in Seattle, Washington, sort of small, really lovely community. And I grew up in high school, I was the head of the Committee for Israel Awareness, also known as the CIA. I was a Joseph Lieberman Fellow through NCSY, which is a Orthodox youth movement, and they took me to all of these conferences, and I was, put up in hotels. I felt very fancy, and I did a number of fellowships that the Jewish community provides, and all of which were aimed at engagement with and identification with Israel. So I was really sort of steeped in that stuff, and it felt really good. It felt really home. And I talk about Zionism as being, for me, precognitive and like sort of just part of the air that I breathed. And also, we've been talking about Zionism and anti-Zionism and the problematics of those terms. And I today, I can call myself a Zionist or not. It feels a little bit less like the label matters a lot to me, but I really do understand how strong it can feel when someone says I'm an anti-Zionist, just like it's a Tuesday and I'm an anti-Zionist. So I also understand that the power of those terms. But so I grew up in this community, really, again, steeped in Israel as an identity. And my best friend moved to Israel when I was 7 years old, and I went to visit her during the Intifada. And then I went to Israel myself for a year when I was 18 years old, and I lived in a settlement. I lived in a seminary, a midrashah, in a settlement called Migdalos, which is just south of Efrat. And I loved Migdalos. I thought it was a spectacular place religiously, but I found it extremely problematic politically because I quickly understood that our neighbors were actually Arabs, and they had left bombs at our gate, and we had to go into the basement because they were shooting at our gate, and I was just like, why are they so mad? And also, I was terrified. I was deeply, deeply scared. So when I was presented with the opportunity somehow, because I was connected to all these fellowships, to go to Hebron, which is where I think a lot of American Jews nowadays especially have their first encounter with what occupation means. And I also, very much a theme of this other Israel Film Festival, which NIF, I should say, is a leading partner in. I took that opportunity, and my parents didn't want me to go. They said, don't go. And it was the first time in my life that I disobeyed my parents. And, I was a good kid. And I went. And I was shocked by what I saw. If you stay for those films here, you'll understand why. And even if you don't, you'll understand why. Because Hebron is an occupied city. There are urban settlements that the army protects. And you see the day-to-day humiliation and violence that happens, and it's astonishing, and it's really it cut me to the quick. Like, it really got the core of what that homeness felt like. I felt like my home had been, like, I don't know, kind of gutted in some way, and I at the time really didn't know what to do. I felt like someone had shot an arrow into the Zionist core, and I went to talk to Danny Gordis, of all people, a person who some of you may know, who has written books about Zionism and the American Jewish community. And just a long story short, like, I had to have a political reckoning. And so now when I sit in the sort of like liberal progressive camp of on Israel, and I sit in the kind of progressive Orthodox space, or what I would call, observant space. I have challenging conversations in both places. In the observant space, it's very difficult to talk about why I feel the way I feel about Israel. And in leftist spaces, I find it very difficult to talk about why I am religious, why I feel like there's value to observance. And so both of those conversations are hard. And I mean, this question is not an easy one for me to answer, but ultimately, like, I do believe in those conversations, and I do believe that the New Israel Fund makes those conversations possible in various ways, both because, they have fellowships for rabbinical students who go, who sort of like deal with these issues through those fellowships, and they have fellows that they take to Israel to actually ask those political questions and work with NGOs that are doing, really critical work on the ground. But I think that ultimately the point of those conversations is exposure, because there can't be integration, there can't be a conversation without, let's say, in leftist spaces, being exposed to religious people. There's usually a kind of like, this is something of an insular community, and needs, I think that exposure is really, really critical. And on the other side also, in religious spaces, at my parents' synagogue, when I talk to, when we're at Kiddush and I'm talking to the whoever it is, like, they ask me questions because they know I work in the Israel space, and I answer their questions, and me being able to put aside some of the, I think, anger that I feel occasionally, and being able to have an open ear and field questions of genuine curiosity and answer them with what I know to be true, I think is exposure that both communities need in order to, like, move forward. For the American Jewish community and for the Israeli community.
And so Michal, I'll ask you the same question, and this is actually something that I wanted to know from what you said earlier. Thank you, Alicia, by the way. You talked about how you feel like your generation is unafraid to ask questions and bring up issues. So I want to ask you, like, a two-part question. Do you think that's true across the generation, including with people that are more right-wing? And And where do you hope that where do you hope the asking of those questions leads?
No, I don't think it's right for all my generation in Israel. But I think that there are really more open-minded to talk about it, even if they are right-wing. And I saw it when I screened the film to people that are not only left-wing, and even people who's living in illegal settlements. I recognize that they are willing to talk about it. And they can watch the film and say, listen, it's important to talk about 1948. We think otherwise, but it's important to talk about it. And I don't think that if Israel will recognize what happened in 48 and God forbid will say sorry, it's okay. They don't want nothing to do with the right of return and stuff like that, but it's okay to talk about it, and it's okay to put it in the school books, what happened in 48. It's complicated, of course, and myself, I'm asking myself those questions. Maybe we didn't have any other choice in 48. Maybe this was our only chance to get our own state. So maybe we did something very bad, but we need to say sorry and we need to fix it somehow. But I don't know if we had another choice. So I think the question of 48 is very complicated. But people are willing to talk about it. And I feel that talking about 48, we are all used to talk about 67, and the conflict started way earlier. And it's not even 48; it's right before. But I think, well, when you're talking about the occupation in 67, I think it's easier because either you're here or you're there. It's black or white, that's it. In 48, it's much more complicated. But since, again, the question, if we had another choice, maybe what happened, it was, I lost the word in English, but I think that's the reason people are willing to talk about it. And I felt in screenings that people want to talk about it, and the first question that people ask me after screening is, so what is your solution? Like, I'm a politician, but so what is your solution? How can we solve it? Because people understand that this is the core of the conflict. And in every peace process or some kind of a conversation towards a peace, or it's a very big and far away word for me, but the first thing that will rise up in discussions will be 48. And I think that the taboo over what happened in 48 is, for the younger generation, it's starting to melt down. And I think that's a great opportunity right now. And I know that it's not only in Israel. When you look on United States, Canada, Belgium, only now people are starting to talk about what happened in the past. And I know that in Canada, last month they did, for the first time, Reconciliation Day, and started to talk about what over their dark history. So maybe we have few more years until we'll be able to do a Reconciliation Day, but I think that the keys for it is it's in the younger generation. It's hard for me to expect my mom or my dad to lead this issue. So I think this is our responsibility.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So Matt, I want to ask you more of an American version of this question. Again, you have your foot, both, you have one foot in the American Jewish community and what you described as kind of liberal Zionism, I think, and another foot very much in the progressive space. You also worked in the Obama White House in the past, obviously. And so again, like, do you feel like healthy conversation between those two segments is possible? And more to the point, like, when those conversations happen, what are you looking to get out of them?
I certainly think that healthy conversation and dialogue is possible, but there are some definite impediments. I mean, you referenced the fact that I worked in the Obama White House, and I'm reminded of one instance where I was in a meeting with President Obama, and it was a meeting with American Jewish leaders, and I had been responsible, among the people responsible for preparing him, so I wrote the memo with talking points, and it was a very contentious meeting around the president's effort to persuade American Jewish leaders to be more supportive of the Iran nuclear deal than they were, and his belief was this agreement was in Israel's best interest and in the interest of overall security in the region. And he started riffing, going off, and he often would go off the talking points because that's how he was, and he's a very smart man. And he started riffing, and he was sort of saying, that he grew up, he was sort of remarking on the fact of, the world in which I, and others in the kind of baby boomer, Gen X generations grew up with images of, the miraculous victory of the Six-Day War. He referenced reading Exodus, Moshe Dayan and his eye patch, the kibbutz movement, the idealism that surrounded the emergence of a new state seeking to find and define its identity, which is something he said he himself personally identified with by virtue of his own journey. And he compared that to what he saw, being presented to the upcoming generations, which is bombing Gaza, Bibi Netanyahu, guns, tanks, militaristic images that are presented. And he said, this is what's coming up, and this is a quandary in these, for the American Jewish community and its relationship to Israel. One thing you said, Michal, there's, the awareness about 1948 versus 1967 is something that I hadn't really keyed into until I had been in Israel more recently on encounter trips and otherwise, because the whole kind of narrative really was focused on 1967 and the Great Victory. So, fast forward to where we're at today, you have a generation, in the progressive community of, people who came of age with this second narrative that, President Obama described. And, what we're seeing with Sunrise or just the other day, last week in Boston, when, there were progressives there who attacked Jewish leaders in Boston for, signing a letter endorsing Michelle Wu, the progressive candidate who just won the mayoral election, and their attack was that, in supporting her, this was an effort by, Jewish leaders in Boston to try to co-opt, newly elected progressive officials to be, supportive of Israel and to kind of almost in a way, buy them off. And, for someone like me and for those of us who founded the New York Jewish Agenda, our progressive values and our Zionist values are consistent for us. And we feel that, there's that efforts to, exclude us, to drive us out, represent an overreach, represent a dividing of people who should otherwise be allied around issues that are incredibly difficult to solve, and that by dividing ourselves from each other around issues of, where we disagree. And I wrote about this in the foreword, this week in an op-ed that I co-authored, when we're dividing ourselves over, our support for opposition to Zionism in connection with our work around other issues like climate. We're only serving the interests of those who want to, defeat efforts of progressives to advance positive social change. And, coalitions are all about people coming together around around which they agree. And, inevitably there are going to be some areas of disagreement, but the effort to define, Zionism sort of as being outside or other from the progressive community overall is something that we're working hard to push back against, and it does present a real challenge.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for that. So, Michal, I want to start with you on this question. You talked a lot about how in Israel people, like you said, are unafraid to talk about 48, regardless of what they see as kind of the future of that discussion. In Israel, I feel like the story of Israel in Israel has changed a lot in recent decades. Do you think that the American Jewish community has a role in that conversation? Do you think Israelis want American Jews or diaspora Jews to have a role in that conversation?
Wow. That's a difficult one to answer. I want to believe that it has a big role. But again, like I said before, I think that there is some kind of disconnection between the Israelis and what are we trying to do in Israel, or maybe to feel that somebody understands us and not only judging us, because it's very difficult, especially in sensitive times like Shomer Chomot, the last operation in Gaza. So you've kind of got the feeling that you're all by yourself in Israel and everybody is very angry at you, and you don't know what to do, except going to Rabin Square and do some kind of a big protest. You feel like you're alone. So I think during the hard times, it's very difficult to feel it. But being here and screening the film and talk about it, I can feel a very good feedback from the American Jews. And again, I have to admit that I was kind of afraid to screen the film here because most of the donation to the Jewish National Fund are coming from the United States, and I thought that I'm going to meet audience that is really pro Zionism and the Jewish National Fund, and I'm coming with a film that has a big critic about the Jewish National Fund, and I was very happy to find people in Canada and United States that are starting to wake up and ask questions about this organization and what happened during those critical years. I can say that I really hope that something will change. When I started working on the film, I told myself that I have a goal and I want to that the Jews of the United States will donate at least 50% less than they're donating right now, because the money is going to the illegal settlements and it's going for corruption in this organization, and they're doing really wrong things that I think that we have to change it. So I'll be happy to talk about the Jewish National Fund and 1948 and what happened since then. And if the film will help me to make this connection, I'll be very happy. and I'm happy to see all the NGOs and the groups here and the journalists and everybody. I being here, I'm feeling that everybody is really care about Israel and not angry at us or it's again complicated and they want to help us and I feel it very, very strong when I'm here. I think, yeah.
Thank you. I have just looked at the time, and it's a little past 12:45, so I want to open up the floor to questions. Thank you to our panelists for your very thoughtful responses. If anyone has questions, yes? Is it? I'm not sure it is.
It is? Okay.
Oh, there you go.
Michal, so you keep referencing 1948. So I was a Zionist when I was younger. I went to Hebrew University. I graduated there. And I graduated in 65. I came back here. And in 1988, I was working for Lucy Davidovich, the Jewish historian, and she had me buy the book by Benny Morris that had just came out. I read this book, and I was depressed for the next 6 months because you say what happened in 1948, but it's much more than that. In Benny Morris's book, you see that in 1937, Ben Gurion said, we have to clear the Arabs out of here. And that's what happened in 1948. And we didn't have a choice. If you read Benny Morris's book and the books afterwards, it's not that they didn't have a choice. They went in and systematically got the Palestinians out of Israel. And at this point, I don't know anybody in my position who says they're anti-Zionist. I'm not anti-Zionist. I'm just not Zionist. And after reading his books, it was just, I don't know how to square that.
I agree with you. Again, like I said before, I don't know if they had another choice. Probably they had another choice or not. Like my father says to me in the film, if you were in 1948, would you act differently? I hope so too, but I don't know. I have to say that, bad things happened in 48, and we don't know even a bit of that. And right now I have a colleague that's working on a new film about what happened in Tantura village in 1948. And I think that more and more people are willing to expose stories and say and talk about the terrible thing that Israel did in that year. And even after 1948, erasing the Arab identity from Israel territory, that's and again, with JNF's forests and everything, it is very clear, and it happened even after 48, during the 50s and later. So yeah, I agree, but we have to open this discussion because I talked with some Palestinians who watched the film, and they told me that the fact that we are ignoring what happened in 48, we're not talking about it, it's a big taboo in the Israeli society, and we even have the Nakba law that says that they cannot mention their disaster day and do some kind of a ceremony in remembrance the Nakba. So we're very far away from starting a healthy discussion about it. my film, I hope that it will open the chance to talk about it, and I think that there is a lot of information that we're not aware of. And the Israeli government is still not allowing researchers to approach the archives of 1948. It was very difficult for me working on the film to find pictures, to find documents. Everything is, we cannot reach most of the information. So we have a big journey on the way there.
Thank you. Did you want to jump in?
I'm actually wondering if I can also respond to this.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So thank you for this question. Thank you for your answer. I read Lucy Davidowitz's book, The War Against the Jews. I know, but I read that book and read Benny Morris's book in quick succession. In high school, I read, this tome about the Holocaust, which is sort of like the incredible history of the whole thing. And then when I went to Hebron, the first thing that I read after that was Benny Morris. And that feeling also, of depression for 6 months, I can definitely identify. And I think that the conversation, that the issues that you bring up, like the Nakba law and the ways that it's talked about in Israel, actually have an impact here in the US. And one of the reasons that a lot of young American Jews have the feelings that they have, and one of the reasons that they're willing to say I'm an anti-Zionist, is because Israel has these laws on the books. And you were also talking about this feeling of being very alone and feeling like everybody is mad at us. And that's really scary. And that's also a feeling, actually, I think that has roots in the Holocaust, that everybody's out to get us and we're here on our own. And if we don't stand up for us, who will? And I think, frankly, that the New Israel Fund, which has offices both in the US and in Israel and does a lot of work to bridge the divide between those things and have conversations between Israelis who are on the left and the center left and even the center and those who are in the US and see what's happening in Israel and are educated on what those laws are about, is part of the answer. And I think that some of the organizations that do work to raise awareness, to fight back against things like the Nakba law, are actually part of the ways that young American Jews can get engaged, to use the term, right, on Israel positively. That to see that there are progressives in Israel who are doing things on the ground to make it more equal, to make it more just, and to make it more democratic, that is part of the answer to all of the questions I think that we're asking.
I just want to say one more thing. The young American Jews that we're seeing in Israel is only the Taglit teenagers. And
Birthright, yeah.
This is the only thing Israelis knows about the young American generation. And I wish that groups from J Street and all these organizations will come visit Israel and meet Israelis and talk with them, because Taglit is the only one, the only organization that Israelis are familiar with.
And often those American Jews who come back, the only Israelis they're familiar with are the soldiers that they met on the bus. And that is a real problem, and it is a problem that NIF historically has attempted to address by bringing American Jews to Israel to meet with the NGOs that are doing that good work, both fighting the occupation, but also doing the work inside of Israel to make it more democratic, fighting for minority rights, fighting for the rights of women, etc.
I don't mean to cut you off, Matt. I want to we have like a few more minutes left, so if other people have questions, and if you could, forgive me, make the questions brief, and maybe we could have a couple questions, and then everyone have one more go-around and call it a day, that'd be great. Thank you. Yes.
Well, this will be a segue to Matt. I'm Nancy Kaufman. I'm chair of the New York Jewish Agenda, but in my many past lives, I've had a foot in the progressive world and a foot in the mainstream world. As both JCIC director for 20 years in Boston and CEO of National Council of Jewish Women. I came of age in 1967, 3 weeks after the Six-Day War, when I went on a BBYO trip to Israel as a teenager, and was a progressive in the United States, seeing our cities burn and being an activist, and thought Israel was the be-all, the end-all, and the answer to all our prayers. So I think you're right, and I think I think the lack of our ability to engage in conversations with young people who disagree with us, and I say us, I consider myself a progressive, feminist, Zionist, who cares about the rights of Palestinians. And I'm not afraid to say that in any room, anywhere, and have. But until and unless, and I'll speak wear my mainstream hat, until and unless those of us in the mainstream understand that every young person who is critical of Israel, or every person who's critical of Israel, is not an anti-Semite, and that we can love Israel and we can love the United States, but we can be critical of each of them. And so I guess I would ask Matt, in terms of the New York Jewish agenda, what efforts are being made to bridge that gap?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy, for the question and for your work over all these many years. I mean, look, the work that is being done to bridge the gap. First of all, as Alicia said and Michal said, is there is a need to have conversations, honest conversations, where we are working together and listening to each other, and being open. I mean, there's such a resistance, I think, in the establishment Jewish community to even broach the questions, or to pierce the veil of the overarching narrative, and there. And the blue box is so emblematic of that to me, right? I mean, I was thinking, I didn't really ever think about what the blue box meant. I'd okay, you put money in it and it goes to Israel and it just helps Israel. But no, actually, it was a very specific thing, right? To acquire land, et cetera. And, this is in the U.S., we're just kind of conditioned in the Jewish community to be, supportive of Israel and not to ask the hard questions. And, to the birthright trips are criticized for, feeding into that narrative. And it's interesting because I took my son to Israel when he was a sophomore in college because he hadn't been, and I wanted him to go. So we went with Rabbi Sharon Brous from Ikar, who's, a wonderful progressive rabbi who, I thought would really speak to his values, which she does and did. But while we were there were these individuals who defected from a birthright trip, while we were there. And basically they went from the birthright trip to the itinerary that we basically were doing on this trip with Ikar. And, going on that trip, made my son, recognize and appreciate the overall complexity, and to look at Israelis as human beings, to look at Palestinians as human beings, and it didn't change his overall, perspective. I mean, he still holds the views that he holds, but I do think that being willing to expose each other, the different sides of this conflict to the other perspectives, and to actually listen to them, and also to find ways, among Israeli progressives and American progressives to work together. And I've been involved in efforts with NIF and J Street and other organizations to do that. We can begin to build a voice that provides a meaningful set of alternative pathways to work and conversation and understanding and manifesting support for Israel and Israelis and Palestinians, and efforts to achieve, greater steps towards something that remotely resembles peace, which does very much seem very far away.
Thank you, Matt. Do we have time for one? Is there one more quick question? Do we have time for it? I think I really like if we could just bundle a few questions together now, and then. Right, fine. Whatever questions we have, let's ask all of them right now, and then we can kind of kick it back to the people up here, down here.
I was trying to give you a softball closing, but I'll bundle. I just want to know, since so much of what you talked about was about kind of bridging divides between different whether it's generational, geographic, whatever. And I'm wondering, since we're at a film festival, what do each of you think film can do, film and television, moving image can do to bridge some of that divide, whether it's practical when freedom of movement is the problem or spiritual? I just would love to hear what you have to say about that, including you, Ben.
Thank you. And are there other questions?
Begin to, we've talked a lot about appealing to progressives and, bridging and so on, but how do we begin to have people who are, to the right of progressives, right, to Americans who really, are very firm in this belief that this is Israel's right to do? How do you begin to get them interested in exploring this issue and begin to think about it?
Thank you.
And we'll take one question from our virtual audience.
So we have a question from our Zoom audience. If rather than anti-Zionism, what is the panel's option for going back to the term diaspora nationalist?
Thank you. That's a little bit of a turn. Thank you for all those questions. In particular, I want to thank you for naming that one voice that isn't represented up here in the panelists is a conservative, that political conservative. So thank you for that. Why don't we do a quick kind of round robin and everyone speak to what was most meaningful to you in those questions. Let's start with you, Micha.
Okay, well, I'll answer Libby's question about film and television and podcasts and all kind of media. I think that film has a big influence and power. And I told Libby a few weeks ago that my dream is to go with the film and screen it to young Jewish Americans, 20, 30 years old, and to talk about it, because I feel that I cannot feel them, and I think that in the film they have some kind of opportunity. The film is telling the whole story in very short and easy way to understand, and it's not to read a whole bunch of books, of boring books, or to sit in a lecture in the university. It's learn about Israel and the Jewish National Fund, or the occupation, or Hebron, in very communicated way. And I think that also young filmmakers that are expressing their voices and their opinion through films and television are really open-minded to talk about it. And the young generation are sitting a lot of the time in front of the television, in front of the iPhone, and this is a great opportunity to bring important content to them. I think and I wish that a lot of young people will come to film festival, but I think we're not there yet.
Thank you very much. Alicia?
Yeah, I'll try and address most of these questions briefly. I will start with your question about how do we sort of go the other direction as well. So there have been a lot of efforts I want to give credit where credit is due, on the part of progressive American, let's say, parents and grandparents, to talk to their young people, to talk to their kids and grandkids. And I think that one of the things that the younger generation, my generation and younger, needs to do is to recognize that not everyone who has a little bit more emphasis on survival is a fascist. Or is like an ultra nationalist, and is just totally, the word that comes to mind is pasul, but I don't know how to say that exactly. Like is out of the pale.
Disqualified.
Thank you, Ben. So I think that's really important, and I think that the culture is actually trending towards the other direction. And I think that if I'm sending a message to the younger generation, including my sister, that's really what I want to say. And I think that is itself like a serious challenge. But in terms of bringing the right along, I actually think that the challenge is a little bit more in Israel. And there, well, you're asking about American Jews, so I don't want to go to Israel. I just want to be clear. Yeah. I think Matt mentioned compassionate conversation, and I think that that's the first step. And there are forums that exist in the United States for those conversations. We can talk about them later, but those are. I think that that's the place to start. I think really compassionate listening and genuine curiosity. In terms of the power of film, one other film. I mean, I think that if you ever planned on reading Benny Morris and didn't, then your film is like another much easier way in, and I think that is an incredible educational tool that can be used in the classroom. It can be used at camp. It can be used everywhere. And I just also like one piece of media that really stuck with me and that also sort of gave a lot of context and education basically was Our Boys, the series on HBO that went through the murder of the Abu Khader murder that led to the violence in Gaza and across Israel, and that the kind of feeling that you're left with after watching a film is very different than the feeling you're left with after reading a book, and so I think that the emotional power is really what we should be trying to tap into, and what your film really does an amazing job of doing, and I'll pass the mic.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess, certainly I agree with what you're, saying about the power of film. And of course, the challenge is to make sure that, more people are seeing these films and we're not just having a conversation amongst ourselves. I mean, I think it's interesting, this film festival is called the Other Israel Film Festival. Like, really, it should be called the Israel Film Festival, right? I mean, what is the Other Israel? I mean, I understand why it's called that. And if it was called the Israel Film Festival, that would send a whole set of messages, right? That would be different than calling it the Other Israel Film Festival. But I guess when it comes to addressing those challenges of speaking to those who are further to the right, I've always I felt like there's a whole way in which the conversation and debate or argument around Israel-Palestine here in the United States kind of takes place on its own kind of plane that's very almost separate from what's actually going on there. Like we're setting our stakes in positions here, a lot of it being like existential. Should Israel exist or shouldn't it exist? Well, it exists and it's not going anywhere, right? I mean, that's not the question. The question is, how can it exist and live to further, values that people there here hold around human dignity and equality and democracy, and then complicated questions around identity and Jewish identity and the consistencies and inconsistencies that exist around that. I mean, you read this article in the New York Times, The Unraveling of American Zionism, which is in the Times Magazine today, which if everyone hasn't read, you should read it. That shows you have a generation that's not only very critical of, the current of Israel and of Zionism, but there's also deeply identified in their own Jewish identity, spiritually, religiously. So it's not like this generation on the left is they're, anti-Israel or anti-Zionist, and they've thrown their Judaism away as well. It's like, no, actually, their positions and their values are very much motivated by their Judaism. And so, I think we need, to broaden our understanding here of who is within our community or within the tent, and be more welcoming and accommodating of this diversity of views, and not view everything that's coming across as critical as some immediate existential threat that requires shutting it down or having a backlash or defining it as other and outside of what's acceptable discourse and engagement.
I have one final thought that ties these two together.
Quickly. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think that one thing we can do to bridge the gap between progressives and what progressives see, and even center and right, and to avoid this defensiveness that you're talking about, of this like very quick to dismiss, is to show them films, because then they have to sit for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, however long it is, and soak in that what is actually being told to them through documentary film or narrative film, and think about it. And I think that there is real power in actually bridging and opening up conversation through film.
Thank you for that. And on that note, speaking of making people sit places for long periods of time, I think we should stop doing that here. But I do very much recommend that everyone see Michal's film, and I've seen that one, so I can say that out of experience, but I'm sure all the other films in this film festival. Thank you so much again to the JCC and to the other Israel Film Festival and all the other sponsors, and thank you so much to my very distinguished panelists. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure we could go on for hours, but just to put a final thought on it, this conversation is kind of talked about in the backdrop of a film about a war and its results, and I don't want to keep anyone hostage. So thank you so much.
Ben.
Thank you, Ben.
Big thank you to Ben. Thank you to Matt, Elisheva, and Michal for being here. Thank you to our partners, to NIF and to New York Jewish Agenda, specifically today. Next up at 2 p.m., we have What If? Ehud Barak and War and Peace. And then at 4:30, we have Michal's film, Blue Box. Please join us, tell your friends, and films are available virtually as well. And we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our audience as well.